So everybody take a seat. Has everybody got a seat that's going to stay? So I've got, is this better? Hello? Okay. Deb is going to be introducing the speakers because I've got to go down to the OWL caregiver meeting. But I reassembled the forum attendance sheet, so I'm going to pass that around. We've got one for each side, and we'll just leave that at the end. If you want to get the forum emails separate from anything else, this is the way to get on that. Also helps us count how many people are here. So, okay. Say again?
Hey, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. Are you awake? Y'all were out partying on Saturday night too long, weren't you? I'm Deborah Binting, and I am the newest member of the Forum Committee. Super excited, and we've got a lovely program. Thank you, thank you. We've got a lovely program today. This is part one of a two-part series. Is that correct? Two? Yes. So I want to introduce our speakers for today. Should I? Okay. All right. So we have Mr. Pastor Dr. Jim White. Yes? Who used to be pastor here from '89 to 2005. I moved back to Colorado in 1996, and I so wish I'd have known about this church because I was still living in that other world. You know, that big E word. Yes, so Jim, his provocative and passionate ministry guided our congregation through a period of renewed witness in this community, encouraging and supporting an engaged spirituality. Interesting how different people can tell a story, right? And that's our story. At every point, Jim brought others to enter into a life of faith more fully and more richly, exploring and drawing upon biblical and historical traditions. He does seem to know a lot about church history, I've noticed. He was committed to relating wide-ranging lessons of historic Christian teachings to the complexities of contemporary life. Sharing his enthusiasm for reading and study, Jim often brought to our congregation's attention thinkers whom he admired, and one of those is coming up, Diana Butler Bass. David Weddle, Professor Emeritus of Religion at Colorado College, where he taught courses in comparative religion, ethics, philosophy of religion, and American religious history, and served as chair of the department. That sounds fun. Golly jeepers. Okay, he's author of Miracles, Wonder and Meaning in World Religions from 2010, and Sacrifice in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, 2017, as well as numerous scholarly articles and reviews. Dave Seyfert, my friend from Pikes Peak State College. We ran into each other the other day on campus. He's an FCC member for like 40 plus years. He's a retired human resources manager, having specialized in employee relations, performance management, training, and leadership development. He teaches sociology at Pikes Peak State College. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and give it away to you.
Thank you, Deb. We're going to be trying this mic out, make sure that it's the right volume. And welcome, everyone. Good to see everybody. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Some of us attended a Congregations Alive conference at the Rocky Mountain Conference the last several days. Leanne was one of the leaders there. And this was a conference dealing with environmental justice in all of its aspects. And so we are, those of us that attended, and many people attended online as well, we are energized, we're enthusiastic And so Deb and Rob, if you're listening, and Ardith, we will be coming back probably in the near future. The great lineup of forum topics coming up this spring. Saw that in the communicator this week. But I'm sure we'll be coming back to ask for some time in the forum in the near future to bring some of what we learned in this conference back from the Rocky Mountain Conference. So, Christian nationalism, threat to democracy. Here's what we'll be doing in the 2 weeks. We'll start out kind of looking at the term Christian nationalism. What is it? What does it mean? How do we define that? We'll ask the question, is the U.S. a Christian nation? That's kind of a rhetorical question, so not a quick, easy answer to that, but we'll pose that as something to ponder. We may talk a little bit about the role of civil religion as related to this topic. And then we'll look at some secular and religious national symbols and what can those tell us about this topic. And then toward the end of our session today, Jim has a real creative approach to tie in this topic with some art and how art can impact our concept of Jesus and Christianity. So look forward to hearing that. Week 2, when we come back next week, we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into some data, and I promise not to overwhelm people with a lot of data, but we'll look at some interesting data that was developed around this topic in recent years, and it'll inform us in a little bit more detail about this topic. David will look at some other religious nationalisms around the globe and suggest, what can happen if we go down that road toward religious nationalism when a particular religious faith gets control of government. And then we'll end up next week looking at some positive aspects of where Christianity has had a positive impact on culture and society. And we'll wind up with your input, your feedback on what should be the response of us as individuals and as a faith community in dealing with the threat of Christian nationalism. So that's the lineup there that I just went over, what we'll be covering. And trying to get the remote to work here. So let's let's ponder these questions. How would you answer these specific questions? Is the U.S. a Christian nation? Has the U.S. ever been a Christian nation? Was it founded on Christian principles and values? And did the founders intend that it should be a Christian nation? There aren't simple answers to these questions. Everybody would probably have a little bit different response to them, but these are to get us thinking about our topic for today. So what sources might we consult to try to answer this question? Well, we might start with the U.S. Constitution. Contains 4,543 words, none of which is God, Christianity, or Jesus. So that kind of suggests that the founders intended there to be a secular form of government. Now, the people that are promoting Christian nationalism will say, oh, but wait a minute, let's go way down to the last sentence. And the ratification statement says, in the year of our Lord, 1787, ratification occurred. So, but then they would suggest, well, let's look at the real document for the founding of our country, the Declaration, back in 1776. And there are, in fact, about 4 references to nature's God, creator, or divine providence in the Declaration. So it's kind of a mixed result there when we look at those documents. But if we really want to better understand the ideas and the intent in the Constitution, we could look at, and David's actually going to go into a little bit more detail on this, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which was drafted by Thomas Jefferson in the late 1770s, was presented to the Virginia legislature when he was governor there, and then it wasn't actually approved until 1786 while he was minister to France. And James Madison actually shepherded this through the Virginia legislature. And this statute, Madison said, was the great barrier against usurpations on the rights of conscience, and that no one should be compelled to support any particular religious worship, place, or ministry, and should not be restrained nor molested in practicing or speaking their own particular religious beliefs. So Madison is considered the father of our Constitution, and that's about as close as we get to trying to understand his intent. The other document I think David will talk about a little bit later is Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists soon after he was elected president in 1800. And the Baptists of Danbury had written to Jefferson. They were concerned about how they might be treated as a religious minority in Connecticut because the Congregationalists were the majority. And Jefferson wrote back, and this is where that famous phrase of a wall of separation between church and state originated. And it's been argued by Supreme Court justices and many other jurists and commentators going back to Hugo Black in 1947. The wall must be kept high and impregnable. But about 40 years later, William Rehnquist saying that jurisprudence has been expressly freighted with Jefferson's misleading metaphor for nearly 40 years. And the discussion and the debate continues, and one can only use your imagination to speculate how our current Supreme Court might weigh in on that question. So, 3 books I'd like to call your attention to if you'd like to learn more about this topic. My primary reference for what I'll be doing in my remaining minutes today, and then a little bit more on this next week, Taking America Back for God. This is a book by a couple of sociologists. So I'm going to leave the theologizing to my colleagues who are much better qualified for that. And as a sociologist, I'm interested in the human thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors around this topic. And I'll be sharing some of the data from this book. That is a good one for it's a data-rich book with quantitative data, survey data, as well as interviews with people who identify as Christian nationalists. Jesus and John Wayne. Jim has just completed reading this. I'm still in the process. We missed an opportunity on Thursday evening to hear Kristen Dumez speak at UCCS. She's the author of this book, and unfortunately she got snowed in Grand Rapids. All the flights were canceled, so she didn't get here, but they're trying to reschedule that in April, so hopefully we'll hear from her. And then this third book, this is how I first got interested in this topic about 15 years ago. we discussed this book in the forum here for several weeks. Revolutionary Spirits, written by a Unitarian minister, and he covers in each chapter a founder and his religious beliefs and how that founder viewed the connection between government and religion. So very interesting book, gives you some of the context of that history. And his conclusion is you really can't generalize because these were individuals, they changed their opinions during their lifetime. And if you try to say they were all deists or atheists or were not Christians, that's kind of a false path to take. But on the other hand, if you claim that they are all Christians in the traditional sense, that would also be incorrect and inaccurate. So it's more complex than that is basically the answer. So what is Christian nationalism and why does it pose a threat? This research conducted by Whitehead and Perry in the book that I just talked about suggests that we can't just say that Christian nationalism is synonymous with political conservatism or right-wing authoritarianism or Christian evangelicalism. There's an overlay with these other ideas or movements, but it's not quite that simple. There's overlap, but there are some differences, some nuances. And ultimately, they use the term a unique cultural framework to describe Christian nationalism. It's really more political than it is religious. And the darker side of this, the reason that we say this is a threat, and I think many would agree, is that this data suggests that those who identify with Christian nationalism appear to share in varying degrees attitudes and beliefs that are associated with ethnocentrism, racial prejudice, sexism, intolerance of ethnic and religious others, anti-LGBTQ plus, and anti-immigrant sentiments. It's all about boundaries and walls and separations and in-groups and out-groups, and they tend to have a very strict religious literalism. Some of the data we'll look at next week will show us that really, in many ways, this Christian nationalism that's being espoused is very different than the concept that many of us would have of what Christianity is all about. Okay, here's a quote from Joseph Williams, professor of religion at Rutgers, who has written and studied this topic extensively. And he defines Christian nationalism this way. It's really this belief that there should be a closer relationship officially recognized between Christianity and the state, and that needs to be protected and restored. And the practical implications are that that's happening at the local level in school boards, school districts. It's happening all the way up to the Supreme Court to try to find ways to formalize this relationship. And it's a process that involves displays on public property, nativist reactions to non-white, non-Christian immigrants. Yes? Okay, sure. Okay, I'll just read that section. Not quite sure why that's happening there. And the practical ramifications of such views involve everything from support for laws that codify specific interpretations of Christian morality to the defense of religious displays on public property, to nativist reactions to non-white, non-Christian immigrants. Thank you for calling attention to that. One additional quotation here. It's really about the belief that America is God's chosen nation and must be defended as such. And it's also linked to some of these other attitudes toward minorities, disadvantaged communities, and gender ideology. And I'm recalling the quote from our JWW speaker last year, David Booth, who made the comment that this really stayed with me: the tip of the spear for the new American authoritarianism is trans rights. And the most vulnerable populations will be those that are targeted. This is a quote from Kristen Dumez, the author of Jesus and John Wayne. And one more input here from Robert Jones, president of the Public Religion Research Institute. We also hear the term white Christian nationalism, and he says that according to his research with PRRI, about 1/3 of Americans and half of Republicans say the U.S. was designed by God to be a promised land for European Christians. So when he talks about Christian nationalism in the U.S., he usually talks about white Christian nationalism. So finally, I'm going to wrap up my segment here with looking at, let's hear directly from a white Christian nationalist. So this is Robert Jeffress, a mega church pastor, and he was a member of the Evangelical Advisory Board during the Trump administration. So what does he say? He's often quoted and is one of the louder voices in this arena. The framers of the Constitution and the earliest jurists demonstrated a clear preference for Christianity. Now, he must be reading a different version of the Constitution than we did. They did not hesitate to declare that America was a Christian nation. The fact that our Constitution demands that everyone have the freedom to embrace any religious beliefs or no religious beliefs does not mean that the government cannot demonstrate a preference for Christianity. The government can, and for more than 150 years did, show a preference for the Christian faith. So I'll leave you to use your imagination and maybe speculate what that might look like, how that might play out, but I'll give you a hint. How tolerant would these folks be if they were able to accomplish their goals? Here's Jeffress again. Not only do religions like Mormonism, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, not only do they lead people away from God, they lead people to an eternity of separation from God and hell. So I'm going to leave you with this quote from former Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun. A government cannot be premised on the belief that all persons are created equal when it asserts that God prefers some. Okay, Dr. Weddle.
Let's see where we are here. Now, my task, whoa, he's a tall guy. My task this morning is fairly simple. I am here to demonstrate to you that the founding figures never intended the United States to be a Christian nation. And my evidence are the mottos and symbols on the Great Seal of the United States, ratified by the Continental Congress in 1782. These mottos and symbols are all non-Christian. Now, toward the end of my time, I want to raise the question, so what? Even if the founders didn't intend America to be a Christian nation, should they have done so? Christian nationalists raise the point that even though the founders may not have wanted the United States to be a Christian nation, we should want that, because only with a religious foundation can we meet the problems of poverty, crime, war. These are matters which Christian nationalists believe can be solved if the entire nation is under Christian principles. So my first task today is historical. What exactly did the founding figures have in mind? They did not intend to make the United States a Christian nation, but why not? They were, as Dave points out, nominally Christian. Most of them attended church. Thomas Jefferson said, "I am a Christian in the only sense in which Jesus intended it. I follow his teachings." They were skeptical about miracles, didn't necessarily believe in the divinity of Christ, but they nevertheless regarded themselves as Christian, which of course raises the question, who has the authority to say who is a Christian? Is there a normative Christianity? Very hard to find that in the history of the church. But more specifically, what the founding figures were most concerned about were the religious wars that had torn Europe apart from the early 16th to the early 18th centuries. Here you had Roman Catholics and various forms of Protestants who slaughtered each other and regarded themselves as carrying out the will of God in doing so. At this point, before there were nations, right, we've been talking about nationalism. There cannot be nationalism until there are nations, and there can't be nations until the great empires and kingdoms of Europe are broken up. All of this happens post-Reformation. So we have all of these wars taking place in the name of a religious country. There was a connection between one's loyalty to God and one's loyalty to the monarch or emperor. In fact, the religion of the monarch was the religion of the people. That's what an established church is about. And it's that integral connection between political power and religious authority that our founding figures sought to break. They wanted to separate that. In the founders' view, religious belief is a private matter and should not direct the course of public affairs. But there's something else here, and that is that religious claims are regarded as absolute truths, taken on faith. And if that is the case, they cannot serve as the basis for rational compromise. After all, if my views are authorized by God, then your opposing views are necessarily false. And there's really no common ground to which we can appeal to adjudicate that difference. The only way to solve conflicts of absolute religious claims is through war or legislation. It is possible to pass laws that will privilege one set of religious claims over another. Now, this fact surfaces in our own time in the struggles over abortion rights. Who, after all, knows whether a 16-cell blastocyst has the full moral rights of a person, and thus protected under the 14th Amendment. That's not a biological question. It's not even a legal question. It depends upon a certain kind of religious conviction. Therefore, debates over abortion rights are very much like 16th century debates over the authority of the Pope. Who is going to settle such conflicts? The founding figures were convinced that this identification of religious authority with a particular kind of political power was at the heart of these history of violence in Europe. And they were determined that would not take place in the United States. So Thomas Jefferson talked to the Danbury Baptists. Do you remember John? Well, some of you might remember that John F. Kennedy went to talk to the Baptists too, Southern Baptist Convention, to convince them that he was not going to turn the United States over to the Vatican, which was their major concern at the time. Right? The Baptists, from the beginning, from Roger Williams' founding of Rhode Island, held the highest premium on religious liberty. And therefore, both Jefferson and Kennedy found themselves required to convince the Baptists that they were going to maintain the separation of church and state. Now, this was Jefferson's famous wall of separation, which is wrong on at least 3 counts. There has never been a walled-off separation between religion and government in the United States. There has never been an established church with a capital C. Here, Jefferson is thinking about European churches, the Lutheran Church of Sweden, the Anglican Church of England. That's what he means by an established church, where if you are a citizen of a country, you are necessarily a member of that church. That's what he wanted to avoid. But the United States has never had an established church. Also, we've never had an established state with a capital S. We change our presidents more often than European countries change their monarchs. So we have neither an established church nor a stable government. And the two have never been separated. So Jefferson came up with a very effective rhetorical ploy, but it simply was inaccurate. Much more to the point is James Madison's comment that there is a line of separation between ecclesiastical and government authority. And that line cannot always be drawn with complete distinctness. In fact, drawing that line is the responsibility of the judiciary, and particularly the Supreme Court, whose judgments have at times drawn the line, erased the line, redrawn the line. We've seen that most recently in the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade. But we've seen it earlier also. Used to be the Jehovah's Witness kids had to say the Pledge of Allegiance in school. And then 3 years later, even in wartime, the Supreme Court reversed that decision. So the line of separation is constantly being drawn and redrawn. We have now an unprecedented situation in which a majority of Supreme Court justices are prepared to launch what the New York Times recently called a crusade to place church over state. Now, under such conditions, how were the founders able to acknowledge a common set of beliefs and ideals without tying them to a specific religion. Think about the variety of religious players in the new states. In addition to Presbyterians in Connecticut, Congregationalists in Massachusetts, who had just recently been hanging Quakers on Boston Common, and Episcopalians in Virginia, there were Catholics in Maryland, Baptists in Rhode Island, and Quakers in Pennsylvania. Each of these groups had been subject to persecution in Europe, and they were wary of each other. The founders' solution was absolute genius. Adopt a symbolic expression of transcendence for the new nation's mission derived from pagan sources, not Christian, not Jewish, not biblical. Benjamin Franklin wanted a picture of the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea on the Great Seal, a sort of assimilation to the pilgrims coming across the Atlantic. And that was rejected by the others, Madison, Jefferson, as being too sectarian. It was biblical. By the way, the same argument came into play when the reading from the King James Bible was prohibited in public schools, because it is a Protestant version of the Bible and therefore sectarian. Now, what instead, as your handout indicates, the founders adopted symbols and mottos from Roman and Egyptian sources, all pre-Christian. Now, those of us who talk for a living almost always transgress time limits. So I do not want to tread on Reverend White's time.
Too late.
You're right. You've already lost 5 minutes, but. So what you have in the handout is an annotated commentary on the Great Seal of the United States, which is printed on the back of the dollar bill. I only want to point to 2 things. One of them is the motto, Annuit Coeptus. He approves our undertaking, which is the prayer of a Roman warrior to Jupiter, in order to have his own battle approved. Now, if you'll notice, the pyramid on the back of the dollar bill there is one that is unfinished. There is a little gap between the main body of the pyramid and the final culminating point of its ideals. And it's in that little gap that every social reformer works, calling the nation to complete its ideal mission, to bring about liberty and equality for all. Out of many, e pluribus unum. May it be so. Reverend White.
You can run this for me?
Yes, sir.
Just want to begin with a little bit of history, and then I've got an exercise for you. I hope you have a piece of paper and some pencils. And at the very back of the room, can somebody catch something? That's some toilet paper I want you to share, and I want you to see the brand on it and pass it along so people can read the brand and know what to order. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the great French philosopher, talks about in the book The Social Contract. He notes that every institution of people always seems to have some religious dimension to it, what he called a civil religion. And a sociologist of religion by the name of Robert Bellah in the 60s coined the phrase the civil religion in America, and he began to talk about the religious propensity that we have in America to attribute things to God, to attribute to the higher authority and submit ourselves to that idea, which is behind much of America. Now, that is not a denominational or narrow or Christian or Jewish. It's a kind of an amorphous God, but it was one to whom we give allegiance. So that kind of came out of the deist perspective that was predominant in this country, especially among the founders. At the time of the Constitution being written, probably only 5% of the population in America was church-related. Very, very small amount of people. But that began to change in the 19th century, in the 1830s, with the Second Great Awakening. And you begin to get revivalism in America and sort of the rejuvenation of commitment to the Christian and to Jesus Christ. And that proceeded all through the 19th century till there was really a major breaking point at the beginning of the last century between the modernists and the fundamentalists. Our church sided with the modernists, and I read a sermon that was preached here in favor of evolution, which was not one of the ideas that the fundamentalists espoused. So that controversy went on, and it was a thought for a while that perhaps the fundamentalists would lose, but they had a rising after the end of World War II, where suddenly in America there was something like 65% of the population espoused Christianity in one form or another, with a few in the Jewish and other faiths also perhaps included. It was a high water point in the triumph of religious affiliation. Since then, there has been more separation, but one of the major separations that happened was the reoccurrence of fundamentalism, which came forth in the form of evangelicalism. All right, so that evangelicalism has become, after the Roman Catholic population, the largest segment of our population. The third largest, interestingly enough, are the nuns, who have no connection to religion. Fourth connections are the mainline Protestants, like we ourselves are. But as the evangelicals began to be more predominant, they began to speak more strongly about themselves and the way that they wanted the country to go. And now we're going to get into the theological discussion. And I want to just tell you about this book. No, that's all right. No, not yet. This book called Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. And that's what we would have heard from the author if she had been able to get here last Thursday night at UCCS. But I want to talk about the corruption of a faith. It's our Christian faith which she says has been corrupted, and it's been mostly corrupted because of a very different image of who Jesus is. Jesus became more and more in evangelical circles strong, mighty, muscular, and women were to become subservient people to the strong masculine man. And that's been what she was saying has taken over in the evangelical circles was this militant masculinity, which talks about the patrimony of a patriarchal authority, which is espoused strongly by so many people like our friend Jim Dobson and Ted Haggard and Jeffers, who was mentioned here earlier, or Mark Driscoll at the one of the churches in Washington that I got acquainted with. So anyway, I want to introduce you to this muscular, militant Jesus, but see if there was other options that we could have had with regard to Jesus. So if we can, Deb, I want to offer some. As best I can see, and as you know, I don't see very well. We could have the baby Jesus, okay? Next, we could have the Jesus that showed up in the catacombs in Rome, which was the good shepherd who carried the sheep around his shoulders. That was one of the earliest images of Jesus. Next one was the Pantocrator. That's an icon that came out of the Hagia Sophia Church in Constantinople, which became Istanbul. Later on, we began to get people that would especially talk about Jesus as the teacher. There was Jesus as the healer, Jesus as the lover, especially the lover of children, Jesus as the one who prays, Jesus as the one who has a sacred heart extended to everybody. That's a very Catholic image of Jesus that prevailed from about the 12th or 13th century forward. We have another Jesus, the transfigured Jesus, and very big in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And they're very meditative and make a lot of that Jesus. It would be true in Ukraine. There's the host Jesus with the disciples gathered around the table, emphasizing the Eucharist. There's the suffering, the crucified Christ that is at the Eisenheim Cathedral, Eisenheim, France, at the Grunewald's Jesus, a very famous picture. There is the resurrected Christ. This has been the most popular image of Jesus. There was over 500 million of these put out and given to soldiers during World War II. And we used to have one that hangs in the library. Maybe it's still there. In recent years, we've had the laughing Jesus. And now I want to get to the different kind of Jesus, one who's much more militant, much more masculine. When Patty and I walked the Santiago de Compostela in Spain, we saw pictures of the Santiago Metamorphos. That's the one who's the killer of the Moors. Well, Jesus begins to appear in this kind of an image. And some of the evangelicals have especially said Jesus is the one on the white horse in the horseman of the apocalypse that comes with the bow and arrows to shoot people. Keep going. And here is yeah. You want to know why Donald Trump was elected? Because they had an idea that we need a strong leader who meets this militant, masculine image. And so, regardless of what his moral character is, we will go for the strong guy. And that's what evangelicals have portrayed out there. And then there he is. That's the great one. All right, is there any more? Oh, yes. Well, in 1925, there was a book written called The Man Nobody Knows by Bruce Barton. And essentially, the man nobody knows what turned out to be a businessman. And they had the Jesus who knew how to organize and do things. All right, now, you should find a piece of paper and a pencil. Everybody got something like that? Or can you pass them around so those who don't have can have one? All right, now don't get together with your spouse if you're here with her, but turn to somebody else. And the two of you, I want you to vote 3 Jesuses that you like, okay? And can we re-see them? Can we re-see them? Okay.
I'll have to go backwards. That's
Okay.
all right.
We'll go backwards then.
You're all busy.
Can you get to the first? Okay. We can't, I'd love to take a time to count hands, but we can't do that.
All right, we're back to Babe.
Okay. You're gonna have to click us forward. Okay.
Go through them again?
All right, time's out. You and your partner have selected 3 Jesuses that you like. Yes? Okay, by show of hands by your partners, how many of you voted for the baby Jesus, the Bambino? Okay. How about the Good Shepherd? Oh, quite a few. All right. How about the Pantocrator, the Greek and Eastern Russian Orthodox? No, not very many. How about Jesus the Teacher? I thought that might be the way that you would go. How about Jesus the Healer? Oh, good, good. How about Jesus the Lover of Children? Quite a few of you. How about Jesus praying? Yes. How about Jesus, the Sacred Heart that's extended out to everybody? Not very many Roman Catholics here. Okay. How about Jesus, the Transfigured one? Yep. Okay. Not many Eastern Russian Orthodox here. Not many Ukrainian Christians. How about Jesus as the host at the table? I was going to vote for that one. All right, how about Jesus, the crucified one? What? Whoa, all right. How about Jesus, the resurrected one? After this sermon this morning? Golly. How about another Jesus? This one, everybody loves. Oh, everybody had one of those in their house. How about the laughing Jesus? That's good. I hope you'd like that. Here we go. Santiago Matamoros. How about Jesus on the horse? Oh, good. How about this one? Come on now. All right, and the final choice. Okay, well, there's other options out there. In this book, Freeing Jesus, which Diana Butler Bass has done, she talks about Jesus as the friend, which he preached about this morning, Jesus as the way, Jesus as the Savior, Jesus as the Lord, Jesus as, there are several other Jesuses. I recommend the book because she'll be here with us in the last of April. Yes?
The library has 14 copies of that.
14 copies of this book available for.
Get on the list to get it, but it's available on the public library.
By donations, all right. I'm finished. You can go home. Thank you very much.
And we'll have part 2 next week. Thank you so much.